Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History Podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week we are going to be looking at the attack on Pearl Harbor. This past weekend, on December 7th, marked the 84th anniversary of the event that officially marked the United States' entrance into World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor led to the loss of over 2,400 service members and civilians. Today, we are going to be taking a look at the events that led to the Pearl Harbor attack. Prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, the US and Japan had been engaged in an increasingly tense rivalry over domination of the Pacific. This came following the, quote, opening up of a previously isolated Japan to the rest of the modern world in the 19th century. In 1853, Japan had been a feudal society. The majority of the land was ruled by a powerful warlord or shogun. At a more local level, power was held by landowners known as daimyo. Each daimyo would have had its own band of samurai who were sworn to protect him. The remaining population were serfs or peasants tied to the land. Much like medieval Europe, Japan had no real central government. Instead, there were 8 to 10 powerful clans that dominated political life. In addition to this feudal society, Japan itself was a very isolated country. They had long since had their borders closed, doing no outside trading and having not fought in war beyond the country's borders in centuries. There was one single Dutch ship that was allowed to port in Japan, and foreigners were not allowed to enter Japan. The Japanese at this time were also not permitted to foreign travel. On July 8, 1853, a fleet of U.S. Navy ships led by Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into the harbor off the coast of Edo, the capital city of Japan, on a steamship, not the one powered by sails. Not sailing in as a form of conquest, but sailing in as a way to force the hand of the Japanese to open up its borders and allow for open trade and commercial relations. Perry would forever change the trajectory of the country of Japan. At this point on the global stage, trade with China had been a booming business, and Japan, who up until this point had not been a part of the trade, lied directly in the middle of the trade routes. After some rather disturbing instances of trade ships being put into Japan due to some storms and the ships having been seized and their crews killed, Perry carried a letter from then-President Millard Fillmore that demanded an end to these brutal events. The Japanese signed the Treaty of Kanagawa that promised humane treatment to shipwrecked sailors and the opening of 2 Japanese ports for trade. This put Japan into a revolutionary time period where the old traditions were replaced with a more modern system of government, including a powerful military, one to match the leading world powers of the day. Having seen Perry's ship, Japan was faced with how far behind in modern technology and military power they were. The feudal system that had long ruled the land was now replaced with a new central government. The serfs were now freed and were transformed into tax-paying landowners. By 1869, Japan had its first telegraph wires, and in 1872, the island had its first steam engine train. With this also came a revolution to its military, bringing in French and German advisors to train the new Imperial Army and British advisors to train the Navy. The Japanese army was becoming its own power that would soon be put to the test. Having won the First Sinno-Japanese War in 1895, Japan proved that it too was now a major player in the world stage. Around this time, the Japanese also took hold of their first colonial territory, the island of Taiwan in the Liaotung Peninsula, which held the naval base at Port Arthur, which would serve as Japan's first foothold in the Asian mainland. The European powers who had held onto world power for a long time were not happy to see Japan entering into the military stage and quickly demanded that Japan return the land it had gained in battle to the mainland. Having been forced by France, Germany, and Russia to return Port Arthur, they grew angry, especially after finding out that in 1897, Port Arthur was now under Russian rule. The Japanese army went under a period of intense growth with a new target in sight: Russia. The surprise of the Sinno-Japanese War had not prepared the world for the Russo-Japanese War that opened with a surprise naval attack on the previously Japanese-held Port Arthur. With the Russian army now disposed, the Japanese were able to bring in massive armies to Korea and Manchuria. The Japanese army was able to offensively push the Russian army back, while showing the world that Japan, who just 60 years prior had been a closed feudal society, had modernized to be on par with the other major military world players. While Japan was winning battles militarily, Russia had a much larger population and were able to keep bringing in troops, while Japan had a more finite number of soldiers. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt agreed to head negotiations for the two nations. In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, partly in the presidential yacht known as the Mayflower, both the Japanese and Russians had to make concessions. Russia surrendered Port Arthur, and Japan dropped their demand that Russia pay reparations. Neither side was happy with the outcome, but Teddy Roosevelt did win a Nobel Peace Prize for orchestrating these peace negotiations. During World War I, Japan fought alongside the Allies and seized many islands in the Pacific that had been German colonies. The success of the Japanese military alarmed the military powers that had long held control of the military stage, especially in Europe and the US, who had many colonies in the Pacific. The 1920s were hard for much of the world, with the stock market refusing to adjust to a post-war world. And with the eventual Great Depression looming in the future, the Japanese government would cut funding to the military from 40% of its total spend in 1922 to just 16% in 1931. The mood within the Japanese military started to turn as the Japanese economy was failing in the aftermath of their exports falling 50% in value. With some radical ideas popping up and some thinking they could save the country, this led to a military that was functioning without the leadership of the civilian government. The goal of this newly radicalized military was to bring Japan into economic independence with self-sufficiency in raw materials. As a naturally resource-poor country, the only way that Japan could achieve this was through conquest. With its close proximity to China, Japan started to seize neighboring lands, riches, and people, as China was now in a time where they were lagging behind Japan in organization and technology. The province of Manchuria was very tempting for the Japanese military, as it was rich in natural resources. So the military moved into Manchuria in a plan that was executed by army officials without any approval from the civilian government. What would follow would be an all-out war with China. You may have heard of some particularly horrific war crimes committed by Japan at this time. I will not be going over them today, but do know that this war was ruthless. All of this is the precursor to what would happen on December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor is located in Hawaii, which now has statehood, but at the time of the attack, Hawaii was not a state. For a majority of Hawaii's history, it was an independent kingdom. In the 1890s, after missionaries from the US sailed to the island and the Dole Fruit Company settled en route, this in itself is an episode-worthy topic and is severely understated in this description, did the Anglo population of the island revolt, leading to the island being annexed by the US. Increasingly, over time, the islands would become a place that the US would use as a naval base. And that would very much be the truth when Franklin Roosevelt ordered the U.S. Pacific Fleet to transfer from San Diego, California, to be located in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. As we just talked about, prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had been locked in a brutal conquest of China since 1937. By the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan had overrun much of North China and was working under the policy of the 3 alls: kill all, burn all, and loot all. In the US, trying to avoid a direct conflict with Japan, FDR had started to set embargoes on arms, scrap iron, and eventually oil as a way to weaken the Japanese economy in hopes that the economy would suffer enough to officially halt the war with China. By the 1940s, Japan had found itself with over 1 million of its troops trapped in China, engaged in a war they knew they could not win. But on the other side of the globe, the rise of a man named Adolf Hitler would give them the opening that they had been looking for. With Hitler invading countries surrounding Germany, many of the European colonies in Asia were left undefended, and these colonies contained many of the raw materials that Japan would need to end the war with China. The Malay Peninsula, the Dutch East Indies, and Indochina were rich in resources like rubber, tin, and oil, especially important in the modern world. While Japanese negotiators came to Washington to talk to the U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, back home in Japan, military planners had already decided that they were going to A, seize the Western colonies that were newly undefended, and B, make sure that there was no way that the U.S. could intervene. The Japanese had set their eyes on the U.S. naval base located in Pearl Harbor. After sending out all 6 of the Japanese military's fleet carriers in complete secrecy, over 3,000 miles away to land a few hundred miles away from the Hawaiian Islands, the Japanese were ready to enact their plan. In the early morning hours on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes flew from their aircraft carriers to the Pearl Harbor Naval Base and in just 90 minutes had destroyed or damaged 19 U.S. warships and 300 aircraft, while also killing over 2,400 individuals. The scene left behind was of horror. The bodies of the fallen were everywhere, in the water, on the land, in the streets, some of whom had never been recovered. The USS Arizona had broken in half and sunk quickly, taking the 1,100 crewmen down with it. Other battleships, including the USS West Virginia, USS California, and USS Nevada, were damaged, but they were later salvaged. The attack was quick, and the Japanese did not hang around after dropping the bombs. The recovery efforts were able to start soon after the attack. With the U.S. Navy now indisposed, the Japanese military went on with their plans and overran European colonies in Asia, including Hong Kong, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and also some U.S. possessions, including the Philippines, Guam, and the Wake Islands. On Monday, December 8th, President FDR announced over radio this chilling speech, which itself lives in infamy. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation and, at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in the American island of Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleague delivered to our Secretary of State a formal reply to a recent American message. And while this reply stated that it seemed useless to continue the existing diplomatic negotiations, it contained no threat or hint of war or an armed attack. It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. Yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night, the Japanese attacked the Wake Islands. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implication to the very life and safety of our nation. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense. But always will our nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of Congress and the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. In the aftermath of the attack, the military worked to prepare the island in case of further attack. With increased support from militaries around the world, they doubled the amount of military personnel to include over 135,000 soldiers, sailors, and Marines. The beaches were surrounded with barbed wire, and the buildings on the island were painted in camouflage colors. Civilians were issued gas masks and hung black curtains to avoid any light leaking out during the night. At the time of the attack, and even still today, a large portion of the population on Hawaii was made up of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans. These individuals were looked on as suspicious, were imprisoned, and even sent to internment camps. Many people lost everything when they were sent to internment camps. Everything that they had worked to get over their lives would be gone when they returned. In 1943, when Japanese Americans were granted permission to voluntarily serve in the military, thousands of young men joined the military. This actually led to Hawaii having the highest enlistment rate per capita during World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor is a significant event in U.S. history, marking the U.S.'s official entrance into World War II. It has been some time since I've personally read about the attack, and I figured that this would be a fitting time to share this event with you, especially with the anniversary being this past weekend. I hope you can leave today's episode having learned something new about the attack on Pearl Harbor. Sources for today's episode include an article from the National Park Service titled "Preserving Memories and Inspiring Peace about the Pearl Harbor National Memorial," an article from the National World War II Museum titled "Pearl Harbor Attack, December 7, 1941," another article from the National World War II Museum titled The Road to Pearl Harbor, The Long Fuse, and an article from the Pearl Harbor Museum titled Pearl Harbor Aftermath, Pearl Harbor After the Attack. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you liked what you heard, please head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts to leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. Thank you again for listening, and I hope to have you in the next one, where we are going to look at what happened during the Japanese attacks on the Philippines just after the attack on Pearl Harbor.